So, as was already mentioned, why pick that subject? I think that the subject has a current political significance, maybe partly because of Occupy Wall Street as well. There has been criticism mostly from the right targeting Occupy Wall Street as anti-Semitic, and there have also been internal debates in Zuccotti Park on how to deal with these attacks, and there have also been some anti-Semitic signs down at Occupy Wall Street. So I'd be interested to also use this space to talk about how to deal with this fact. And also, as was just mentioned, some of you may know that anti-Semitism has been a major issue in the radical left in Germany over the past 15 years, and caused many groups and friendships to split, and a phenomenon as the so-called anti-Deutsch or the anti-Germans to emerge. If that is of interest, I can talk more about that. But I thought that rather than going into like a descriptive history of that, focus more on like maybe an analytical comparison between the German and the U.S. situation, and figure out what similar debates. Or why a similar debate here has so far not been held, and if that's necessary at all, or if we think that the situation here is a completely different one and anti-Semitism gets overrated. So about the talk, about the evening, I'll start off by kind of defining what I mean by anti-Semitism, and how and why that plays out in the left, specifically around the issues of capitalism and its critique, and also around Israel-Palestine. And then give maybe some thoughts on where I think the similarities and differences are between the US and Germany, and finally turn to political strategies. And I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and afterwards there's time for discussion. And so certainly you here in this room are much better experts on the US situation, so I'm looking forward to the discussion for you to challenge my arguments. So I'm going to start off by kind of talking about how I use anti-Semitism in this context, and because I would argue that anti-Semitism, unlike the way it's normally used, I see it as more than simply anti-Jewish racism, or more than simply like prejudice or discrimination. I would say that anti-Semitism is basically an anti-modern worldview, and an ideology that's very deeply linked to bourgeois society and a supposed critique of it. And that's not to say, I mean, of course, anti-Semitism has elements of racism to it as well. So Jews have been essentialized as a group and have been assigned negative attributes and discriminated against. So those are all like mechanisms that, racisms have. But I would still say that there's important differences. And of course, this is a bit generalizing because necessarily, obviously, there's differences between different racisms. So, there's different images of blacks or Asians or Arabs or other groups. But still, I would say that very generally speaking, when you speak of racism coming from colonial racism, the other is usually constructed as kind of inferior and uncivilized, or imagined as somehow subhuman, symbolizing nature and overboarding sexuality, and associated with the body and with emotion, kind of childish, much rather than the mind or rationality. And he or she is seen as, less intelligent, criminal, lazy. So as a result, this other is, somebody that's suppressed, kept down, exploited. The stereotypes associated with Jews are usually, or to a large extent differently. The Jew, quote unquote, is usually associated less with nature than with modernity, with society. He or she is seen as kind of over-civilized, a modern individual that's kind of suspiciously intelligent and cunning, has a frail body, at least the male Jew, quote unquote, again. So kind of like the rootless cosmopolitan that does not care for community or country. So an individualistic, materialistic, and powerful being that is an agent or an inventor both of communism and of capitalism. So what we see there is that all the negative aspects of modern society can be found in the Jew, again, quote unquote. And since Jews are perceived as either openly running the world or secretly internationally conspiring to do so, anti-Semitism is an ideology that I would argue ultimately does not necessarily seek to keep the other down, but ultimately has to destroy him or her or the Jew, because the association is that of perceived hegemony or power. So it is basically, anti-Semitism is basically eliminatory, as Daniel Goldhagen called it. And I think this difference points to the fact that anti-Semitism is intrinsically linked to modern bourgeois society. So that's something that Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer have pointed out in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I still think is one of the best texts concerning anti-Semitism, when they say the Jews are the scapegoats not only for individual maneuvers and machinations, but in a broader sense, inasmuch as the economic injustice of the whole class is attributed to them, unquote. And Adorno and Horkheimer also show how individuals that are basically constantly crippled by domination in a society that's based not on people's needs, but on the inherent drive for profit, how they develop hatred towards Jews. So, quote, no matter what the Jews themselves may be like, their image, as that of the defeated people, has the features to which totalitarian domination must be completely hostile. Happiness without power, wages without work, a home without frontiers, religion without myths, unquote. So basically, the Frankfurt School sees anti-Semitism as a pathological expression of capitalism's tendencies to get rid of the possibility of a radically different world. So again, to clarify, when I speak of anti-Semitism, I'm not merely talking about a form of prejudice or a specific form of racism. Anti-Semitism, like I said, has these elements too. But when you perceive it as an anti-modern ideology that's inherent to bourgeois society, it opens up a perspective that goes beyond like a mere thinking in in-group, out-group categories. It is aimed at central features of modern society, like abstractness, universality, mobility, and aimed against capitalism, however wrongly understood that may be. And all this then gets identified with the Jew, quote unquote. So, like, one of the political consequences also means that, you know, when you speak of anti-Semitism as an ideology, the speaking position, so to say, is no protection against it. So this is like, you know, a worldview that Jews can hold as well as non-Jews, and Jewish and non-Jewish leftists. So maybe let's turn to anti-Semitism and the left. Obviously, anti-Semitism has been an integral factor to European societies, and I'm going to cut that history short. But a relevant factor in most societies, developing from like an anti-Judaism in the Middle Ages to what increasingly became like a racialized form of modern anti-Semitism, and specifically in Germany, national identity was very strongly, developed very strongly in opposition to the Jews, quote unquote, and obviously was a mass movement among the general public during National Socialism, and that enabled the Holocaust. And still after 1945, the polls show like a very high level of anti-Semitism, depending on what poll you look at, between 1/4 and 1/3 of the German population. In the United States, anti-Semitism came over here with the settlers, with Christians. It was most visible during the large immigration waves, around the turn of the 20th century, so between 1880 and 1920, and then later in the 30s and 40s as kind of like the high time of American anti-Semitism, with people like Henry Ford, Father Colin, and quotas in colleges, and Jews specifically being targeted during the Red Scare. It decreased after 45, so depending on what poll you look now, the ADL says there's about 15% of Americans that hold deeply anti-Semitic views. But 15, that's their number from 2011. It's gone a bit up. It's always been, for the past few years, according to their poll, around between 13 and 17. So I'm not going to go into details. Obviously, there's much more details to different European societies than the United States. But I guess to sum up, you could say, it's an ideology that is linked to bourgeois society, like I just explained, and it's a cultural tradition in Western countries. So with these kind of foundation, it should not be very surprising that it can show up on the left as well. And I mean, certainly, the self-perception of the left has always been one that's, against, it's on the side of equality, a movement that abhors discrimination. And I do think that, what is called primary anti-Semitism, like actual discrimination against individual Jews as Jews, will be less visible, or, will be less of a problem in the left. it may play out on a subtle basis in everyday situation, like individual Jews being perceived as whatever, loudmouth or pushy or cliquish, and I certainly don't want to downplay that. But more likely, I think it'll be linked to more general political issues that are dear to the left. And I would contend that after World War II, those are two areas. First one is capitalism, its analysis and the resulting criticism of it, and the second one will be Israel-Palestine. So to start with the first one, capitalism, I think that here in this context I do not need to make clear that a critique and basically the abolishment of capitalism is in the interest of humans and a necessary political program. So I'm not saying that anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism are necessarily linked, but I speak of specific forms of anti-capitalism which have kind of like an incorrect or foreshortened critique as their foundation. So what I mean by that is a critique that points to the sphere of circulation and its agents as kind of the expression of capitalism. It focuses on financial markets, on bankers and their individual decision, spectacular greed, and so on. And it's basically a critique that is not taking into account that exploitation is happening in the sphere of production. So when I say exploitation, I mean that in the Marxian sense, not in the common sense. So I don't just mean crappy working conditions and child labor and violation of human rights and falling wages. That's obviously all happening, and everything that fights that is great. But even good working conditions mean wage labor and mean are the basis of a system that's again not based on people's desires or material needs, but on the necessary drive to make profit. So this kind of production means being forced to compete in the drive to make more money, and it means exploitation of workers and squeezing out surplus value. And that's not happening because individuals are greedy, but because of competition. And a foreshortened critique of capitalism basically pits this productive labor and industry against money and finance, and exchanges a critique of a system for a critique of individuals. And again, that's not to say that capitalists or corporations should not be criticized, and that there's no element of personal choice involved, or in personal responsibility. And Marx also spoke of capitalists, but he also made clear that they're character masks, as he said. They are forced into a specific behavior by their circumstances. So now I would say that this version of a critique of capitalism shows structural similarities to an anti-Semitic worldview, as explained before. So it includes elements of personification that explain social phenomena as the conscious acts of evil individuals. And I'd like to talk later about how dominant that you think this perception is in Occupy Wall Street. So, after all, with this kind of idea, there have to be some people that are the exploiters, that are running the world consciously or conspiring to do so, and they have the same character traits that have been assigned to Jews for centuries. So they're, well at handling money, deceitful, conspiring, powerful, greedy, ruthless. And opposed to them is oftentimes some kind of community, often a national community. And, in this kind of Manichaean worldview, the people, quote unquote, are often like a mythologized, imagined community that's honest and hardworking, and their interactions are direct and immediate, and the presumed well-being of this community is kind of seen at the mercy of evil powers. And if it wasn't for those evil powers, the community would be industrious and healthy. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer, to come back to them, they pointed out that this perception of capitalism, again, is no coincidence, saying that, quote, the responsibility of the circulation center for exploitation is a socially necessary pretense, quote unquote. While they draw strongly not only from Marx but also from Freud, Chicago professor Moshe Postone, kind of as a current critical theory thinker, focuses his analysis of anti-Semitism and capitalism mostly on Marx's critique of political economy, especially on the fetish chapter in Capital Volume 1. And in his essay, Anti-Semitism and National Socialism, Postone points out that, quote, the modern anti-Semitic worldview understands the abstract domination of capital which subjects people to the compulsion of mysterious forces they cannot perceive, as the domination of international Jewry. The abstract, that was actually a quote from History and Helplessness, but it's the same argument that he makes in Antisemitism and National Socialism. So basically, the abstract, the exchange value, is something that is personified in the Jew, quote unquote. And by exterminating the Jew, the anti-Semites hope to get rid of capitalism of itself. Postone called Auschwitz a factory to destroy value. That's certainly quite a provocative statement, and one does not necessarily have to agree with it, but it kind of sums up the idea that he's trying to put forward. So why this is, what's relevant about this for the left is that, again, Postone points that out in History and Helplessness, anti-Semitism can appear to be anti-hegemonic. It can be a kind of fetishized form of oppositional consciousness that appears to be kind of the movement of the little people against some kind of intangible global form of domination. Why this motive, this kind of conformist rebellion against kind of the perceived personification of capitalism is attractive to a left agenda is pretty obvious, I would say. So that's one part where anti-Semitism becomes relevant for the left. The other issue that is currently most important after World War II is Israel-Palestine.
What about the anti-capitalism?
Right, that's what I just spoke about. Why the left perceiving itself as anti-capitalist. And
I thought they blamed the Jews also for anti-capitalism.
Well, they have also, the Jews have been accused of being responsible for capitalism, but also have been accused of, being right. That stereotype exists as well, but I think it doesn't play out as much in the left because, the left traditionally is anti-capitalist. So for Israel-Palestine, kind of like a similar introduction, I just want to make clear, especially knowing the difficult communicative situation in the U.S., that I don't equal criticism of Israel policy with anti-Semitism. I do, however, want to point out to certain structural similarities between, again, certain critiques of Israel, or between anti-Zionism, anti-imperialism, and anti-Semitism. And I do think politically, that's in the interest of the left to do that, rather than have our critics do it for us while falling into false accusations. So, again, after 1945, after the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, open anti-Semitism had kind of fallen from grace, so to say. In Germany, anti-Semitism never disappeared. The Allies attempted to denazification, but it lived well on. But to a certain extent, what happened was it got banned from the public sphere, and it had to find alternative, more acceptable forms of being communicated. And in Germany, specifically, a critique of the newly formed Jewish state was one of these forms. But also, Israel played a specific role in other parts of the left. So even when you look at, the Soviet Union under Stalin, you saw that there was like an early pro-Israel course, and then a turn to an anti-Zionism that was very often also anti-Semitic. So it associated, the fight the fight against cosmopolitanism and Jewish internationalism, and Jews were under the suspicion of dual loyalty. And you can look at other socialist states or the former GDR, where there was also often a very clear mashup of criticizing Israel and targeting Jewish communities or individual Jews, and those were attributed with classic anti-Jewish stereotypes such as like external enemy within that's conspiring to undermine the nation. In the West German left after 1945, you had a first like a pro-Israel pro-Israel positions. Israel was seen as the state of Holocaust survivors, and also observed because it was seen as like a socialist experiment, especially with the kibbutzim that was seen as pretty progressive. And what happened was that you had an anti-Zionist turn after '67, after the Six-Day War, and that happened both in the New Left and also in the like Marxist-Leninist or Trotskyite so-called K groups. And after '67 in Germany, you had various instances that show that a critique of Israel can include or did include elements of anti-Semitism. And I mean, the list for that is very long, but, it includes things like demos against the Lebanon War in 1980 that were not held in front of the Israeli embassy, but in front of synagogues. So kind of suggesting that German Jews that have, lived in Germany for forever, basically, were somewhat responsible for that. Or, just the rhetoric used that Israel got accused of the quote-unquote final solution of the Palestinian question. So, basically having become the executioner of another Holocaust. So, accusations that are not just historically inaccurate, but also in a German context. This is a few decades after World War II. So that also served to detect attention from, Germany's past and turned basically the former victims into perpetrators. It's also interesting to look at the more militant left groups and the discourse in the Red Army faction and all that. But just to give you one example, in '69, a militant left group in Berlin that came out of the anarchist subculture, they chose the date of November 9th, which is the anniversary of Reichspogromnacht, or what's sometimes called Crystal Night, to vandalize monuments that commemorated the persecution of Jews and planted a bomb in a Jewish community center. And in their communique, they claimed that, quote, Crystal Night of 1938 gets repeated every day by the Zionists in the occupied territories. Jews expelled by fascism have themselves become fascists, who, in collaboration with the American people, wish to erase the Palestinian people, unquote. These kind of actions, I mean, the list is long and I'm not going to get into it, but underlying them was usually a form of anti-imperialism that showed, again, structural affinities to an anti-Semitic worldview as laid out above. So Postone speaks of anti-Semitism as the anti-imperialism of fools, so kind of following this characterization of anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools that supposedly was Social Democrat August Bebel. Apparently it was somebody else, but doesn't matter. What's his name? Kronawetter, like an Austrian social democrat, but it's always, as far as I know. Yeah. So, again, it's not, of course, that's not to say that a critique of imperialism is not necessary, or that it is necessary, or that it necessarily shows these affinities. But I think those examples kind of show that a critique of the Jewish state and its creation have at times been close to anti-Semitism. And I think that calls for an awareness of the discourse. And how to separate anti-Semitism and a legitimate critique of Israel policies, we can, I'm happy to discuss that later. But I'm also more interested in how, just how much awareness needs to be paid. I guess that would depend on the context. And that's why I would kind of continue comparing the German and the U.S. situation. So when comparing these, I guess my argument is that, while there certainly has been and still is anti-Semitism in the U.S. left, it's certainly not as widespread as in Germany. And I would nevertheless contend that here there's a remarkable ignorance towards anti-Semitism. So my impression is that when it gets brought up as a topic within the left, or even challenged in inner left debates, it easily gets brushed off and is much more likely to get tolerated than racism. I would say that, as I've said before, that while the left's general ideas of anti-discrimination and equality will prevent, in a lot of cases, anti-Semitism on an individual level, there is no reason why people on the left also here should not tap into that as an anti-modern ideology. And I think, therefore, it's important to explain kind of why and when this is actually happening or not happening. And I would, I want to kind of explain what in a given national context, Germany or the U.S., what the factors are that support or hinder the emergence of anti-Semitism on the left. And I would say that there are different factors that will influence perspectives on anti-Semitism, including those that make it more likely that anti-Semitic positions are actively taken. So I kind of would cluster them into two fields. One of them being left theory concerning, capitalism, anti-Semitism, imperialism, so kind of like the theoretical foundations of the left. And then the other, kind of the national and social framework that surround these, or where these, the context where these theoretical foundations play out. And so let's kind of look at the first ones first, like the theoretical foundations. I don't know if that's visible. I'm kind of... The italics are supposed to be the factors that kind of facilitate the emergence of anti-Semitism in the given context. So I would say that, the theoretical foundations are similar in the United States and Germany. Certainly not for all of the left. This is always, I have to generalize, but they can be found in both countries. So when you look at the critique of capitalism, you do find, a personalized and moralizing critique in some parts of the left. And I explained the problems with this earlier. Often this is linked to a kind of a Marxist-Leninist worldview, and it's something, that's influential in parts of the left to this day. I would say that's the case both for Germany and the United States.
Do you think that a personalized and moralizing critique of capitalism is linked to a Marxist-Leninist worldview?
Well, we
I'm just curious,
yeah.
because normally that strikes me as an unusual assertion.
Well, I would say that if you kind of have like a Leninist, like a Marxist-Leninist, in the real socialist kind of sense, explanation of capitalism, you will have, or it's more likely that you have the idea of kind of a ruling class that, for example, actively promotes ideologies like racism and anti-Semitism to split the working class, that kind of knows what they're, knows more about how the game is run than the average person, and that kind of actively promotes the system of reproducing itself, rather than perceiving capitalism as a system that follows an inherent logic, partly, despite the will of individuals. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that later. So the second factor is, a strong tradition of anti-imperialism in both contexts. Again, it depends on how that imperialism is played out, but it can lead to an interpretation of the Middle East conflict where it is seen merely as an imperial conflict, where kind of like an artificial nation state is pitted against some, an organic community on the other side. And I think that will mean that anti-Semitism in Arab countries as one of the factors that is also, determining the Middle East conflict gets interpreted as a mere reaction to Israel's action. So you also have like this idea of good versus bad nationalism. Again, that's also something that you will certainly find amongst like a Leninist worldview. So Zionism is the bad nationalism without any distinction between different strands of Zionism, and Palestinian nationalism is kind of in the tradition of third world liberation movements. So I would also argue that you can find that both in Germany and the United States. I also think that understanding anti-Semitism as a form of racism and prejudice only can kind of not necessarily, it won't cause anti-Semitism, but it will create a climate where it's not taken seriously. So I think that that's something that I do encounter in the U.S. context. And I think it also, the specific situation here where, the Jewish community has been very upwardly mobile after 45 and has been whitened, so to say. You have that, and then on the other hand, you have, for a very good reason, the fact that anti-black racism has been, primary concern of the left, and to a certain extent, anti-Muslim racism after 9/11. But what it ends up becoming is that you have these kind of competing racisms, and if anti-Semitism is perceived as one of them, then certainly it's not like a primary concern and not a threat on an individual level. So I don't think it's a surprise that it's not seen as an important issue here. In Germany, I think there have been some discursive changes over the last 15 years, partly through this intervention of the anti-Germans. But also because anti-Semitism is more visible on a day-to-day level. So, it happens much more frequently that people that are openly identifying as Jewish get attacked on the streets. There's certainly no go areas for Jews, even in Berlin. and cemeteries get desecrated, and so on. So I think that maybe there's maybe a bit of a difference in Germany. Also, kind of an underlying ideological factor that's more relevant for Germany and that promotes anti-Semitism is anti-Americanism as a central factor of German self-understanding. And, I'm not speaking of like a rational political critique. There's good reasons to criticize American foreign policy even in Germany. But anti-Americanism kind of as in like an ideology where, everything that the United States seen as kind of like the force of evil, and this has a lot to do with German defeat in World War II, and in Germany it's very strongly linked to anti-Semitism again. So the Jews are being seen as influential in the United States, both get kind of the same attributes of pure decadence, money and greed, and seen as the symbols of capitalism. And that's something that has been, and to a certain extent still is, like a dominant sentiment in the left. And so in the US, of course, the United States left is critical of the United States. I do sometimes think that happens in a very Manichaean way, like, what was said in the introduction, this logic of my enemy's enemy is my friend. And I do sometimes think that there is a lack of criticism towards Islamist movements, authoritarian and reactionary regimes, and something that, and again, I'm pointing to that Postone article, History and Helplessness, because I think it's pretty great, that becomes a problem, especially after 9/11. But I would say that this anti-Americanism here is linked less to anti-Semitism than it is in Europe, but maybe people see that other ways. So this is one thing, kind of the theoretical foundations. Now let's kind of look at the national and social context. And whereas I would say that concerning the theoretical foundations, there's a lot of similarities between Germany and the United States, in concerning the kind of social context, you have big differences. For one is that, concerning the national self-understanding, anti-Semitism, I mentioned this before, but historically has been very strongly linked to German sense of national self. So when the German nation was founded, the Jew was, was seen as a major opposite, and it's, you had a deep-seated anti-Semitism that obviously culminated in Nazi Germany. And I'm not speaking about, like a German nature or so. This is obviously like historical traditions and ideologies that are widespread, and that are still widespread to this day, I would say. And it also leads to the fact that something like being Jewish and being German is still perceived as, sometimes it's something that doesn't go well together, or something that's perceived as being an opposite. And I would say that you don't have a comparable situation here in the U.S. I mean, anti-Semitism has never been a central ideology in the same way. Certainly there were times where it was, very widespread, and you could also argue that Christianity is central to an American self-understanding. It certainly is by far the dominant religion. But I would say that, still, at least after 1945, Jews have been kind of accepted into the U.S. mainstream, and being Jewish and being American were not seen as opposites. So the second factor is that in Germany you have a phenomenon that I call secondary anti-Semitism. So I mentioned this before. After 1945, anti-Semitism was not done away with; it changed. Jews were now blamed for not allowing Germans to identify with their nation. This was an anti-Semitism not despite of Auschwitz, but because of Auschwitz. So this, it was made up of kind of rejecting guilt, responsibility, and commemoration, always connected to this call for wiping the slate clean and being able to identify with the nation once again. So another factor of it was kind of distorting or revising history, including like the relativization of the Holocaust and exchanging perpetrators and victims. So I don't know. For example, there's a large public discourse around the bombing of Dresden, turning Germans into the ultimate victims, we can talk about that later, but I'm just name dropping that as a current example. So again, basically, anti-Semitism lived on, but it was no longer officially accepted. It had to find other ways, which is why this discourse around Israel as the kind of the collective Jew is particularly interesting in Germany. I would say that in the United States you don't have a comparable phenomenon, as you don't have a secondary anti-Semitism as such. I guess some people would argue that there's a certain amount of shame involved on a certain level because the U.S. turned away Jewish refugee boats or didn't bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz earlier. But it does not mean that Jews or the Jews prevent the identification with the nation or something like that. On the contrary, the Holocaust can kind of become a pretext for nationalism. After all, it was the United States and Americans that fought National Socialism, which certainly was the biggest atrocity of mankind. I do think that this very connection is also criticized by the left. I think that I have the impression that sometimes that leads to the fact that Holocaust remembrance is merely seen as a nationalist project. So people on the left, kind of saying that the U.S. ignores the genocides against Native Americans, for example, or doesn't commemorate, the people that were killed in various South American countries. And I think this involuntarily can lead to belittling Holocaust remembrance or the specifics of the Holocaust and maybe foster anti-Semitism. So two more kind of points concerning the national or social context. I think that in the U.S., you do have a communicative situation where there's groups that criticize anti-Semitism either in itself or criticize within the anti-Semitism in the left, and these groups are often on the right. So to take Occupy Wall Street as an example, there was an ad that was run on YouTube and other channels by the Emergency Committee for Israel, kind of like a conservative think tank that portrayed the whole movement as anti-Semitic. And in that case, that was clearly an accusation that got used to stifle the debate. And the left response here, it seems to me, is that it seems to be that anti-Semitism gets framed as a topic of the right. So it's connected exclusively with accusations of anti-Semitism rather than taking it as an issue that the left needs to proactively work on. I think that is a problem for the U.S. left that causes a certain ignorance towards anti-Semitism in some cases. And I would say that here in Germany you don't have a comparable situation. There's no groups that are visible as AIPAC here or ADL or something. And the organizations that do target anti-Semitism, not just in the radical left, but more on a civil society level, are very often liberal or leftist, NGO types, but even foundations or so. So this is it's not an exclusively right topic. And maybe finally, in Germany, you have, after 1945, a very small Jewish community, which also means that, there's very few Jews on the left. I don't know, I'm not certain about this. I mean, this is certainly different in the United States. I think it can serve in sometimes as kind of like a correcting factor, so to say. People pointing out, Jews on the left being aware of anti-Semitism, pointing that out and challenging comrades, which is something that does not happen so much in Germany. But maybe it can also be the opposite. I don't know. I'm not so certain about this point. But so, kind of maybe to sum up, I would say that the theoretical foundations that part of the German and U.S. left draw from are often the same, but the context causes it to be a much more imminent danger in Germany. And for the U.S., I guess the danger is more, as I see it, not acknowledging anti-Semitism as an issue to kind of proactively deal with, and but often perceiving it as primarily a form of racism and a subject that is inherently linked to conservatism, and that causes it to be not be acknowledged and seen as somewhat unimportant. So, coming to the end. Oh, this is just an octopus. maybe just come a little bit to the political implications that I see. To quote Postone for the last time in History and Helplessness, he says that anti-Semitism is, a very determinate problem for the left. And whether you agree with this or not, I would like to talk about political implications. I would say, first of all, I think there, needs to be an awareness that anti-Semitism has been and can be a problem for the left, and a sheer denial kind of will make things only worse. And I think this also means a responsibility to make kind of a careful analysis of the arguments that are brought forth specifically in these areas that I mentioned. And I think this is also important for kind of left-right overlap. I think it's no coincidence, for example, that David Duke praised Occupy Wall Street, and the way he did it was, certainly using anti-Semitic arguments. I do think that most importantly that we need to get our theories straight, so understand the way that capitalism works as a system, and understand kind of, and use that as a prevention to anti-Semitic thinking. Is that me? No. To quote Horkheimer and Adorno in The Dialectic of Enlightenment, also, one last time, individual and social emancipation from domination is the counter-movement to false projection. So, while a truly emancipated communist society is certainly no guarantee for doing away with anti-Semitism, I would say it's a necessary prerequisite, and a critique of anti-Semitism and a critique of bourgeois society, or the other way around, a critique of bourgeois society and a critique of anti-Semitism necessarily will have to go hand in hand. Yeah, so I'd be curious to discuss this, and I think it would be really interesting to discuss it against the background of Occupy Wall Street, because I think that's a really good example, because there have been singular incidents of anti-Semitism. They have been documented on YouTube. From the right, those were used to kind of slander the whole movement, and from the left, there have been very few voices that were worried about these specific instances. There was much more, the people were mostly worried about the attacks, not about the instances. So there have been a few. There's been an article by the Marxist Humanist Initiative. There's some, that I put some copies back there, and some other leftist blogs. But and then there's been a rally against anti-Semitism in Brooklyn after some arson attacks there. So Occupy Wall Street participated in that after they get accused. But it seemed like the left was mostly busy fending off the right, and not asking whether there's a real problem at bay or not. So I'd be interested in talking about what you think of that. And also it might be interesting to talk about the dominant rhetoric at Occupy Wall Street. This, this idea of the 99%. I know why some people are very much in favor of that, and why they see there's a lot of benefits to it, but you also see a lot of moralistic and personalized critique down at Zuccotti Park, a lot of display of nationalist symbols, slogans like Main Street, Wall Street must die, so Main Street must live, vampire banks, black suck our blood, and something that some arguments that are in their structure show some affinities to anti-Semitic arguments. And I'd be curious to hear what people think of that, if they see that as problematic or not.
Yeah, thank you. So shall we take some questions?
And I'll pass around the sign-up list if you guys receive announcements for
Please.
I hadn't until recently thought much about specific sort of this sort of German thinking about anti-Semitism and something. But because of platypus and a few other things, recently I spent a lot of time in dialogue with people on the German left who come from somewhat of an anti-Deutsch milieu or influenced by so become sort of quite familiar with it. And first, it struck me as very exotic coming from the American context. And while I've developed an appreciation for certain aspects of it, I think that what troubles me most about this is there seems to me to be an intellectual gesture in which anti-Semitism is to some extent being redefined. In other words, if you change the meaning, you can use the term however you want, if you change the meaning of anti-Semitism from racism or prejudice or hostility to Jews, to what one, I don't remember where I read it, someone called it a falsche Kapitalkritik, then it seems to me we're talking about two different things. So in other words, a lot of what I often feel gets labeled anti-Semitism seems to be a form of bad leftism or bad anti-capitalism. But I don't think it's helpful to then call that, even if one disagrees with it strongly, anti-Semitism. And on the question of Israel and Palestine, which I don't want to get into, but which I actually have had much more experience with, I think that precisely because anti-Zionism is so frequently a mask for anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic attitude, it's also important to actually emphasize that there is a logical distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And I guess the other thing that I was struck by when you're talking about the diagram, you have the arrows pointing to the Jews and Germans as sort of defining opposites. It seems to me that, well, obviously that paradigm was certainly present, that it would have been much easier before 1933 to think of oneself as both a Jew and a German than it would be afterward. That there's a caesura in German history caused by National Socialism, which sort of reproduces, not just among anti-Semites, but reproduces generally in the minds of Jews and Germans, a sense of opposition and a kind of polar opposition between Jewishness and Germanness, which of course many German Jews of the late 19th and early 20th century would have found alien to their own experience of what it meant to be German and Jewish. I'll leave it at that.
Can I have a bit of a follow-up on that? I mean, I similarly am a little worried about the extension of the term anti-Semitism, and I think for me it's, why use anti-Semitism and not say like anti-modernism? And I think I sort of thought of three sort of components or three sort of examples of why, to me, I worry about the use of the term. One, that actually a lot of and I mean, you mentioned that Jews can be anti-Semitic, but like a lot of the components you were describing, I grew up in a relatively religious Jewish education. And a lot of the way you described sort of anti-modernism was how my Jewish community talked about like secular intellectuals, that they like got into the community and took apart our organic community. A lot of the idea of like a deep a deep heritage that goes back the generation that's being disrupted by like turncoats and traders from within was an idea I heard quite a bit in my Jewish school. Now, I mean, you can say that, well, that's anti-Semitism, but literally that was like the foundation of the Jewish identity that I was being taught. And so to say that like the foundation of Jewish identity in an Orthodox school is anti-Semitic, to me just seems very hard to wrap my head around. Another couple of examples I thought of was, the issue, an interesting way to pursue this question is like the tradition of anti-intellectualism in American culture, which I do think there's quite a bit of, and I think like quite a bit of on the left. And I think what's interesting and actually, sort of like historically variable is when that is an anti-Semitic, like when that becomes explicitly anti-Semitic, or when it is much less in the way of anti-Semitic, when it's not as much associated with Jews. So like there is an image of like the New York intelligentsia kind of, that the right will use as like a battering ram against cosmopolitan intellectualism. But it's at least my impression that that's not as much associated with Jews at the present, at least in sort of mainstream right discourses. You have to go sort of very far to the right when that becomes like explicitly Jewish. And the third sort of example I thought of was, in understanding sort of Nazism itself, it seems to me again as like it's a broad brush that undoes a lot of the kind of a few different differences in Nazism itself, like one being the fact that like parts of Nazism were anti-capitalist and other parts were not so much. In fact, like a lot of the internal dynamics of Nazism were sort of fought out over how anti-capitalist, quote unquote, would this movement be. And two, how much was the German population's like belief in anti-Semitism, what the Nazis were cashing in on, like what led them to their popularity, versus how much of it was sort of the Nazis were right-wing opportunists that would kind of pull out anti-Semitism for certain audiences, put it away for other audiences, that would, play up certain kinds of anti-Semitism versus others. It seems to me that all those distinctions kind of get lost with defining anti-Semitism as reactionary anti-modernism.
Mm-hmm.
Or might distinguish between the question of causation and the question of definition. And it seems to me that Postone understands it in a causative sense, and many of his German followers understand it in terms of the definition.
Can you clarify that? Sorry.
Well, I mean, as I understand, like Postone's original conception, he's giving an explanation of the sort of political power of anti-Semitism. So, in other words, it's a reactionary anti-modernism tied up with opportunistic right-wing politics fuels anti-Semitism, including and eliminative genocidal anti-Semitism. But that's an argument about causation. There's a difference I find with a lot of the anti-Deutsch, where this argument about causation then becomes almost like a definition. And when you have the definition, then like the problem of like actual Jews or the actual victims becomes sort of secondary to this idea that the problem is really like a bad critique of capitalism, and it's sort of like the actual empirical reality of like what, and again, like Jeremy's example about his right-wing, Jewish education. I mean, by the definition that some anti-Deutsch use in anti-Semitism, you'd have to conclude a large portion of Israeli Jews were anti-Semitic, because not because they hate Jews, but because they too, like many other people in capitalist societies, have these notions of personalized notions of capitalism, and so the same type of protests you have in Occupy Wall Street or all over the Arab world. You have massive protests in Israel this summer. A lot of those ideas about capitalism that are manifested there are as problematic as anywhere else in the world. But I don't think you can really see that as a manifestation of anti-Semitism, unless you're giving anti-Semitism a kind of bizarre redefinition.
Socialism of fools or foolish socialism?
Or just like I mean, I've spoken to Israeli Jews. I mean, who have like notions of capitalism very similar to those that are being critiqued at Occupy Wall Street, speaking about their own Israeli society.
Right.
And I wouldn't, there's a problem with that, but it's not anti-Semitism.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I need to respond to it.
Yes.
So one
Yeah.
is anti-Semitism being...
Maybe we can take after.
Yeah, can we come back
Yeah.
to
We've
that?
had a lot.
So one is like anti-Semitism being overbroad as a category and like encompassing just a bad critique of capitalism, anti-intellectualism, the anti-modernism within Judaism, Jeremy's example, and the role of anti-Semitism and Nazism being like too flattened, which I don't know if,
Yeah. I do see the problem of using anti-Semitism as like as a term for a reaction. If you use it as a term for a reactionary anti-modern worldview, or like as a term for a personalized critique of capitalism, then yes, then you will end up with many phenomena that you would have to call anti-Semitism. So, and I do think that's a problem also in the anti-Deutsch discourse, where people came up with this term of structural anti-Semitism. So, of course, anti-Semitism doesn't need actual Jews, but as an analytical term, you end up having many phenomena that you can call anti-Semitic. You could probably call the Rwandan genocide anti-Semitic, because a lot of the stereotypes that were used, had these elements of structural anti-Semitism. You could look at, I don't know, some the images of merchants merchants in Asia, in some Asian countries that are attributed with these very same images that a lot of Jews got attributed in Europe. So if you call all that anti-Semitism, I think you'll have a problem at some point, because you lose. I mean, you lose the view, the perspective that at some point individual Jews will get targeted as Jews, and so I do think it's important to kind of distinguish what you're actually talking about, and if you're criticizing a false critique of capitalism, then you should name it that way. Or if you're criticizing a reactionary anti-modern worldview, then I don't see why you should call it anti-Semitism. I do think why that it's helpful to look at it as an anti-modern ideology is because I would say that not everybody who has this worldview can be labeled an anti-Semite, because a lot of people have, and they might live in societies where Jews are not even part of the imagery, let alone like the actual life world. But everybody who is anti-Semitic will have this worldview, and I think it helps in understanding how anti-Semitism works. That it's not just thinking, oh, the Jew sitting next to me is stupid, but that in most cases there is more that is associated with that.
I mean, can I just say one?
Yeah.
There was an Enlightenment form of anti-Semitism that was the exact opposite. That was about the Jews being overly traditional, stuck in their mores, unable to assimilate into modern society, and in fact, anti-Enlightenment. And so that's why, so they were like the ultra-Christians, or they were just as bad as the Christians, or worse, etc., because they were unenlightened, unable to take the fruits of science. So it seems to me that's an example of an anti-Semitism that's not a reactionary anti-modernism. If anything, it's like a reactionary ultramodernism, or whatever. You can pose it a different way.
Well, I mean, I think that's why I try to point out that anti-Semitism, there is elements of racism in it, and this whole idea of Jews being like religiously backward and stubborn about that and all that. That's an association of Jews with being overly traditional in a way. But I do think that this association of Jews with modernity and everything that goes with it has become a kind of dominant form of anti-Semitism with the emergence of modernity.
Let me ask you.
This gentleman.
Please.
Yeah, I have a few points. First of all, I want to ask you if your organization has some purpose in this research, some practical implication of educated or expose the anti-Semitism in the lab. Secondly, I have a couple of notes. I just have a visit to show you how anti-Semitism was rooted. I have a very dear friend, 75 years old, from Italy, who just visited here. And he was a president of a bank. And he told me about how the Jews control all the banks. And I asked him, do you have any specific example? He said, Rockefeller is Jewish, isn't it? So such an ignorant of people who consider themselves very enlightened. And there is a phenomenon here in New York, at least, that Jews are very active in the far left against Israel, boycotting disinvestment and sanctions. And the way they manipulate the situation of the poor Palestinians into, I consider it very troubled anti-Semitism. That's all. They are the leaders. There is an organization of Jews for Palestine, but there are others, and many of them, the leaders are Jewish, and they're proud of it, and they see if they take care of the underdog Palestinians, but at the same time, they blame the Jews, and I think it's anti-Semitic. That's all.
Okay, so maybe to your first question, the organization I'm with does not specifically work on anti-Semitism, but we do promote a lot of, we do a lot of workshops, events, panels around anti-capitalism. That is, of course, focusing on what I said in the end, trying to make people understand how capitalism works and approach it from a different perspective that, is not personalizing or anything like that. We have also participated in coalitions against, in anti-fascist coalitions in commemoration of the Holocaust, or fighting Nazi demos that were openly anti-Semitic. So it's it's a subject that we think is politically relevant. At the moment, it's not one of our main foci, but yeah.
Just one more note I forgot. For my simple knowledge, that in Germany is the least anti-Semitism in all Europe because of education that started very early after the war. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I mean there are some countries,
More than,
especially
England and France.
there are some countries like in Eastern Europe where the polls show a higher amount of anti-Semitism, but in Germany it is definitely still quite widespread. So there's
But
still a lot.
relatively to other countries, it's the least, as far as I know.
I don't know. Maybe you're familiar with different
No, just
polls, but
from general
as
knowledge.
far as I know, it's Germany is somewhere in the middle of the European countries. I'm not sure I understood your last comment or question. I mean,
About,
there's I know
Jews are
there's
very active in America, in New York,
Right.
in particular against Israel.
Mhm.
Jews for Palestine, and I consider it anti-Semitism.
yeah, I would say that you would have to look very specifically at the organizations. Yes, there are very many organizations where Jews are active and are visible as Jews.
Yes, they
and
are.
I think for a lot of people, that is like a strategic decision to kind of, come from the speaking position as Jews and position themselves against Israeli policies. I think you would have to, maybe you have examples. Maybe it's most. I was going to say maybe it's most fruitful if you take an example of a specific campaign, and then we can talk about whether we would consider that anti-Semitic or not. I think in a lot of cases,
I consider it that way,
Right, and I'm just asking you what the example is that you have.
One of them, I think the name is Jews for Palestine.
Mm-hmm. And you think that's an anti-Semitic statement?
Not the statement, but when I go to their meetings, the way they talk, I mean, they use Jews, or they believe that they are enlightened Jews, that they fight for the underdog. But I think it's anti-Semitic. They don't distinguish between anti-Israeli policy and anti-Israel in general. And they think the whole story of Zionism, anti-Zionism, it's become anti-Semitic. While from my point of view, Zionism was a national movement, like any other in that period. So, and people in America, in general, who come to that particular meetings, they are very ignorant about the facts and the history. And the history of the Middle East is very complicated, even for people who live there. And coincidence, they hear one story and immediately they become anti-Israeli. And I think it's associated with anti-Semitism. That's my
Mm-hmm. I think it's we would.
It's
have
what
to-
you say too.
It seems to me that you can be an anti-Zionist though and still be, one, you could be anti-Israeli policies, so like specific policies. Two, you could be anti-Zionist. And three, you could be anti-Semitic. Sometimes they go together, but I don't think necessarily so. I mean, I would consider myself an
What I saw,
anti-Zionist.
they mixed everything together. I understand. I know the distinction between this.
I was going to go, I was interested in, you mentioned Occupy Wall Street. I was actually been much more, I mean, in the United States, the main debate on Occupy Wall Street about anti-Semitism seems to be between sort of Jewish liberals and Jewish right-wingers. So it's interesting that the criticism, there was more criticism from groups like Marxist humanists and a few other like esoteric Marxist sites than anti-Semitism on Wall Street, whereas sort of mainstream Jewish liberals were saying, "That is ridiculous." So, or this site, I don't know if you know this guy Bill Weinberg.
Yeah.
this new Jewish resistance.
Yeah,
Whatever. So,
yeah.
he had whereas the mainstream sort of Jewish liberal discourse was saying, oh, this is like just an attack. I guess like the other thing I was curious about is what kind of discourse there was around the Iraq War, because I think that's where the whole question of sort of Israel, America, Jews making U.S. foreign policy. I mean, I was actually present in one of the early anti-Iraq war demonstrations, and I saw a sign that said, Jews plus Roman Empire equals dead Christians, Jews plus American Empire equals dead Muslims. I think everyone in this room would agree with me at some sign. And certainly there was a discourse around, quote, the neocons, which is very much connected to an anti-Jewish discourse.
Like the Adbusters.
Right,
article.
like the Adbusters. And yet, at the same time, if you looked at opinion polls, American Jews were more likely to oppose the war than the American public at large, although some of the people most pushing for the war were also obviously Jewish, just as like a lot of prominent Wall Street people are in fact Jewish, like Lloyd Blankfein. Not that that has any fundamental relevance, because again, it's a structural question about capitalism, not about ethnicity. But I'm just sort of curious how that discourse sort of played out in Germany in particular.
Mm-hmm. I mean, to your first comment, yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of, like kind of from the Jewish liberal side, I have the impression that the argument is mostly pointing at the many Jewish, visible Jewish activities down at Zuccotti Park. There's
Right,
like this Occupy Judaism side, and then they had the... Exactly. So, and kind of pointing out that was not, people did not get attacked or, like that, and that certainly is true, I mean that. But also, like, I do have the impression that the instances of visible anti-Semitism, guys with signs saying Google, Jews, Zionists control Wall Street, and this incident of that teacher in Los Angeles that got interviewed. Maybe you've come across this video, but I'm sorry.
So her last name is Rothschild.
No, that's somebody else. No, an LA teacher got interviewed, and she, she goes into this rant on how the Jews should be run out of this country. I'm quoting that right, but along these lines, and very.
One of the organizers refused to sort of condemn it. She was like, "We're open ideologically on Occupy Wall Street. We don't, we're
exactly.
not right or left.
Yeah.
Blah blah blah. No matter how much I might personally disagree."
Right. So, I mean, instances like that where I would think that, it's that the left in and out of itself should kind of take a stand. And yes, it's very good that people don't get openly attacked down at Zuccotti Park. But, still, this is like why, I mean, people do get attracted to the movement. And you also have you have conspiracy theorists down there. And I don't know. I'm just surprised that there's so few. I mean, it seems like the reactions from the left do come because of the accusations from the right, not because these statements are seen as a problem in and out of themselves.
Well, also, one problem with Occupy Wall Street is that leaving aside any question of anti-Semitism, a lot of people there are right-wing cranks. I mean, you've got a lot of people there who are into abolishing the Federal Reserve, which is not part of any. I think that's the solution. Go back to the gold standard.
And some people actually holding anti-Semitic signs were, in fact, basically chased out, which is a pretty radical move at Zuccotti Park. It's a militantly pluralist atmosphere for people to be told to leave.
Yeah, or people standing next to them holding another sign saying asshole or something.
But I think that the question about anti-Semitism is tied into the question about how, the left itself is confused with what's left and right. So you have a lot of right-wing cranks there. And there's a sense of an inability to distinguish between the right-wing cranks and some kind of different left ideology. And so someone like Ron Paul, who, among other things, has, let's say, definitely anti-Semitic overtones, but certainly is a right-wing Republican by any rational standard. Lots of leftists were he was very popular among a lot of stupid leftists, I mean, and the guy clearly has both anti-Semitic and anti-black overtones, but even aside from that, his whole ideology is so blatantly right-wing. We wonder that the ability of people on the left to distinguish between left and right.
When we did the tabling for platypus at the beginning of the year, people kept coming up and, how do you feel about Ron Paul? Like, what's your opinion on Ron Paul?
Brian, did you have your hand up earlier?
No.
Okay.
You asked about the Iraq War, right? And how that played out in Germany?
Germany.
Okay. I think the Iraq War is actually an interesting moment where, what happened was a lot of people went on the street. February 15th, 2003, big thing in Europe, London, Berlin, all over the place. Those same kind of people were suspiciously absent from going on the street a few years earlier when Germany bombed Yugoslavia, first time that Germany bombed another country after World War II. This was actually a turning, this was like an important point for a lot of anti-Deutsch theory or like anti-Deutsch groups. Because, all these people that claim to be so anti-war, pro-peace, like vaguely leftists, interestingly enough, were not so anti-war when it was their own nation. But what you could see on the street was a lot of anti-American rhetoric, and this, I use this word very consciously because it was not like going on the street with an analysis of why is the U.S. waging this war, how does that fit into national interest, and why is Germany opposing this specific war, and how is that connected to Germany's interest, but just like being on the street because again the United States is waging war, and so this. I actually saw this as a movement that, in some parts, was very much motivated by a nationalist sentiment. Part of that also this is also where like Israel and the United States got very tightly linked to each other, and a lot of the rhetoric against Israel was certainly motivated by anti-Semitism, I would say. So I don't think that the 2003 anti-war movement in Germany was necessarily progressive. Certainly there were also progressive elements, but it's a good example for a social movement that, does not necessarily want to have the same idea of emancipated society.
And what about right now in terms of personalized criticism of capitalism when the bankers in Europe, places like Greece, the bankers are not Jews but Germans? How does that play out in terms of the way the German left understands the crisis in European?
I haven't for the past 2 months or so. I haven't followed up the European process very much because I was here. I was talking to a friend yesterday who just came from Berlin, and he made an interesting observation correct me if I repeat it wrongly, but he said that he had the impression that here you have much more, people focusing on how the financial crisis affects their personal lives, home foreclosures and, in all different ways, and putting that on the agenda. Whereas in Germany, what he observed with the Occupy movement was much more like the focus on the banker as kind of like a scheme. And then, of course you could say, okay, the crisis has not arrived as much as it has here, so lesser percentage of the population has been affected and is able to share their personal stories, but also like he kind of found that remarkable, and I kind of share that sentiment that, it's one thing to have, I don't know.
What is motivating
Right.
German left anger in the Occupy movement there, because it hasn't reached the same levels, and also I think a lot of the radical left in Germany is taking a very skeptical perspective towards Occupy Wall Street for that same reason, and all the reasons you mentioned. Yeah. Almost, in my view, a surprisingly and maybe over-skeptical view, but in my conversation with people there, it's like, convince me why this isn't just an anti-Semitic populist mob. Questions? Comments?
Tell me something about the Platypus Affiliated Society. What is it?
So Platypus is a group. We have chapters across the states that's focused on the history and problems of the left. their reading groups and discussion groups.
Is
And,
it Marxist-Leninist?
it comes from a Marxist critical theory perspective. There's the Journal of the Platypus Review in the back. And
It's not a political party.
no,
Not a political.
Oh, he was literature in the back.
yeah. And feel free to sign up
I mean,
for the.
maybe just Zeena as a suggestion, or at least one way in which I'm kind of processing this now is, to me, like, and goes back to Richard's point about the definition thing. It seems to me that, like, by not treating it as definitional, then you can actually sort of trace, and I think you do this somewhere in your paper, you can trace the kind of, like, you know, when these things meet up, like when reactionary anti-modernism of some kind or another meets up with anti-Semitism, meets up with anti-Jewish racism, say, if we call that anti-Semitism, and that forms this kind of particular ideological constellation that we have seen in places like Nazi Germany, in places like much of the kind of reactionary movements in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. Other times they don't meet up, which it seems to me is like more the case in the U.S. And at least of late. And then the question is, well, why? You know, I think again you address this somewhere in your paper, like why should it be that you can have quite anti-modern ideologies in the U.S., both on the right and on the left, that don't seem to have an element of Jewish anti-racism. And what is it then that these ideologies sort of latch? Sorry. Yes.
We do have the other one.
Again, so kind. And then, you know, what is it that these latch? Like, who is the Jew, or like, what do these movements latch onto in the stead or as their bête noire? I mean, it seems to me a kind of interesting question how this kind of plays out in different historical contexts in different places.
Yeah. Agreed. Was there a question implied that I didn't
No,
get?
I don't think there was much of a question. It was a reflection.
Yeah.
Final thoughts? And thank you all for coming out.
Thank
For a
you.
very interesting conversation.
Thank you. Zeena,
Thank you. Platypus.
all the way from Germany.
Haha.